I'm the director of the Health, Community and Development Group at the London School of Economics, where we're based in the Institute of Social Psychology. For a number of years, the group has been a gathering point for students and researchers from all over the world who've been doing work in 6 continents, and our particular interest is the impact of social inequalities on health, and more particularly on the role of collective action in enabling marginalized communities to tackle the negative impacts of social environments on health. We have a master's program, we have a doctoral program, and we have a very active and quite exciting research program. And old HCD alumni are now all over the world engaged in a range of community projects. What we're going to talk about today is a growing trend within our research and our study, which is to look at the focus of community arts-based approaches as tools for marginalized communities to build awareness and activism in relation to health improvements. And we use various methods. We've used photographs, participatory video, theatre, drawings, a lot of work on children's drawings, for example. But one method that's become particularly useful in our work is that of Photovoice, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Photovoice is an approach which we'll talk about in some detail in a moment, but just to give the background, it uses Paulo Freire's work, and particularly his conception of a reflection-action cycle. It's a method which groups can use for developing, firstly, voice, a critical understanding of the impacts of social circumstances on their health, and the capacity, confidence, and ability to make demands to more powerful groups. And secondly, to create receptive social environments in which people with political and economic power are willing to listen to the demands of the socially excluded. So what we're going to do today, around the table, we have 3 HCD researchers who've been particularly active in this area. The first is Morten Skovdahl, who was one of the co-founders of the Health, Community and Development Group, and he has used Photovoice a lot, very effectively, in his work in Western Kenya with child carers of parents dying of AIDS. And he's used the approach as a way of feeding into important work he's done around social action funds and also around supporting AIDS-affected children in all sorts of ways within their communities. Morten is from Denmark, but has done most of his work in East and Southern Africa. Secondly, we've got Kathy Vaughan, who's an Australian development specialist, and she's done a lot of work with young people and is a particular expert on Papua New Guinea. And she's used Photovoice very effectively in her work with young people in Papua New Guinea, both in the context of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, but also in the context of young people keen to tackle the social exclusion that places their health at risk more generally. Finally, we have Robin Sutherland, and Robin is a researcher from Canada, and she's used Photovoice, particularly building on Kathy's work, very effectively in Northern Ontario, where she's worked with young people, socially excluded young people, in the interests of creating social environments that enable the well-being of young people in conditions of deprivation and diversity. So that's all I'm going to say to introduce. I think Kathy's going to start off talking a bit about her work, and we'll take it from there. Kathy, you've written and thought quite a lot about Paulo Freire's work, and maybe you could kick off introducing your work by talking a little bit about the theoretical background.
Okay. So in thinking about the theoretical background of both the work that I did, but more particularly of Photovoice as a method, it is very much drawn on the work of Paulo Freire. Caroline Wang and Marianne Burris, who were the first authors who really documented the use of Photovoice in southern China, worked with rural women to try and identify their health priorities by giving those women cameras. And in doing that, they were extending Freire's work that he did with line drawings in the culture circles, where he was trying to stimulate dialogue in community groups by getting people to discuss issues that were important to them. Photovoice takes that one step further by handing over the responsibility for identifying what's important to the participants or the community members that you're working with. So it is very much based on Freire's concept of dialogue, that is, people engaging in discussion and debate with each other and recognising each other's knowledge as legitimate and important, but often quite different, but through the dialogue with each other coming to a new understanding. The characteristic of dialogue is that you co-construct a new knowledge about a particular topic. From that new knowledge, there emerges an understanding and a critical reflection that all knowledge is partial and that it's also socially constructed, so that how people think about their communities, how they think about health, and their experience of health is shaped by the social circumstances in which they live. And that getting people to talk about that also gets people reflecting and thinking about the circumstances in which they find themselves. And through that, there's the potential to identify opportunities for critical action, so that the reflection has to be linked with action. Freire always used to say that critical reflection on its own is really the equivalent of navel gazing and blah blah blah, and that action that wasn't informed by critical thinking was sort of activism for activism's sake without having any underpinning for that. So really that they need to happen together.
Can you talk about how you've put these theoretical ideas into action in your own work? Maybe start off by saying a bit about the context,
Okay.
and then tell us what you've done. And what we're particularly interested in, I suppose, is your notion of in-between spaces, which I think is a way that you've extended both the Photovoice method and Freirean thinking in a sense.
Yeah, the work I was doing was in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, which are amazing, is an amazing part of the world. It's very beautiful and very rugged, but parts of Papua New Guinea where there's limited economic development for rural communities, and a whole range of health issues that young people face, including substance abuse and violence, as well as an emerging HIV epidemic, which was where my background and interest originally came from. And I worked with 3 different groups of young people in the Highlands using Photovoice, so giving young people cameras, giving them training in how to take photographs, and then asking them to take photographs of things that they thought had a positive influence on their health, as well as things that they thought had a negative influence on their health. We held community exhibitions where the young people asked community leaders, traditional leaders and elected officials, as well as bureaucrats and health workers and NGO representatives and donors, a whole range of decision makers to these exhibitions, where they had an opportunity through putting their photographs and stories up on the wall to communicate their perspective on health. In doing so, what had been very much a youth-focused space and a youth-owned space of the workshops where young people had been working together with their photographs and story writing was linked with the world of decision makers, which is often a very impenetrable world to young people, and that exhibitions in themselves were like an in-between space joining the world of young people, where they come to this critically framed and articulated perspective on health, with the world of decision makers, trying to bridge those together and extend the young people's networks, so that their social networks, so that they included community decision makers and leaders.
Can you talk us through some of your photos?
The experience of engaging with other young people about the photographs that they'd taken and listening to their peers discuss different health issues, and also the act of going out and looking for things to photograph, meant that the young people were seeing things differently. They see things that they've taken for granted or haven't noticed before, which is very in alignment with Freire's notion of starting the process of developing critical consciousness, means that you need to interrupt those assumptions and the taken for granted. So that happened during the process of the workshops, and an example of how that was shown in the photographs is by the photographs that were taken by Moses. Moses was a young man who was quite shy and reserved in the groups, but by the end of the process was starting to become much more engaged in the discussions. And then he put together 4 of the photographs that he'd taken at different times through the process of the project, and linked together different health-related issues. The first photograph he took was of a road in his district where the road had completely collapsed and there hadn't been any funding for fixing that road. Because the road was broken down, it meant that subsistence farmers couldn't get their coffee and other products out to market, and so it was affecting the income of local families. But it also meant that that part of the district now became very cut off, and teachers, for example, weren't willing to go and teach in that school because they were isolated from the wider district. That had an impact on a whole range of things in the local community, and it meant that there wasn't so many of the state-provided services getting through to that particular part of the district. The next photograph he took was of a local school building that shows the school's really broken down. It's made of bush materials, but it hasn't been maintained, and partly that's because the parents don't have any spare income to give to the school for maintenance of school infrastructure, because they can't get their products out to market because the road's broken. And also they can't see the value in maintaining the school when there's not a teacher present. And the teachers aren't getting through because of this problem with the road. The third photo he took was of young children who look like they're about sort of 7 or 8 years old, going out picking coffee. And so the families in this area had decided that it was more important for children to be contributing to the family income through things like picking coffee than being in school, when they couldn't see the value of being in school given the state of school infrastructure in that community. And then the fourth photograph Moses has taken is of a marijuana plantation and a young man, a teenager who's growing that marijuana, and he's linking these 4 different issues which seem quite separate in some ways, but he's saying that because the roads aren't being maintained, the schools are collapsing. Because the schools are collapsing, kids are being taken out of school. Because kids aren't getting an education and don't have opportunities from that education to get a job, for example, or have broader horizons in life, they're left with the very limited economic opportunities for them. And so one of the things that kids are doing is growing marijuana. In the last bit, he's said children who don't go to school are at risk of ending up being influenced to be in activities like producing drugs or homebrewed alcohol. This last photograph shows a young man who never finished school is now producing marijuana. He doesn't see a good future. So we need to maintain the services like roads and schools in North Waihi District to keep kids educated and busy and give them a chance at a better future. So he was showing actually quite good critical thinking of the underlying reasons of why young people are ending up taking drugs and alcohol.
And can you talk a little bit about how you use these photographs in action after the Photovoice exercise?
So after the initial Photovoice project, we had the exhibition. So that was the first part of action, actually, was because it brought the leaders and the young people together. And initially I hadn't thought about the exhibitions in that way, because I thought that was something I'd instigated and sort of saw it as part of the research process. But actually when I interviewed the young people after, it was very clear that to them that was their project, their exhibitions. They had really taken ownership of it, and they saw it as something important that they had done, and that it was their opportunity to link with community leaders. After that, whether the young people all then developed small plans of things that they would like to do to try and address some of the health issues that had come up in the project. Whether those plans actually were put into place was less about the participatory research process and more about the context in which it was happening, the social spaces that the research was happening in. So in one of the communities where the district leaders and officials and traditional leaders were very supportive of the young people and they formed a good relationship, they were able to put their plans into action because there was an environment that supported them to do so. In one of the other communities where, for example, very few of the invited leaders came to the exhibition, there wasn't the same motivation for those young people to be able to then put their plans into action. So all of the groups, there was some small activity, but it was really only in the group where there was engaged leadership where they could actually really take more substantial action on health.
Mm. And in some sense, I think that's the way in which we're all trying to push Freirean thinking, is around saying that it's not enough to build consciousness and voice amongst marginalised people. It's also important to create receptive social environments,
yes,
to work to create environments where opportunities and environments where powerful people are willing to listen to the voices that have emerged in the Photovoice exercise.
And yeah, that's right. And I think finding ways to create a chain of links between people, because even in Barnes, the district where there was a good relationship between the leaders and the young people, and the district administration were very supportive of the work that the young people wanted to do. They're too low down the hierarchy, really, in the government structures to be able to influence some of these big issues that were identified, like violence, like youth unemployment, like the school fees that, primary school education is not free in Papua New Guinea, and that is a huge issue, but it's a national level issue. And so you sort of see that there needs to be a chain of spaces where people of different levels of social power are brought together to articulate their concerns and to engage in dialogue and come to a new understanding about a particular issue, all the way from village level through to national level.
Thanks, Kathy. Let's turn now to Robin, because I know that Robin drew very heavily on your writing in framing the work that she did in rural Ontario. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about your program, its aims, what you think it's achieving, because obviously it's ongoing, and possibly also talk us through some of the photographs.
Sure. Yeah, I think that there actually are quite a few parallels to be drawn between my work and Kathy's, which I think really kind of speaks to the usefulness of the Photovoice methodology and how flexible it can be in different contexts. So I was working with a remote community in Northern Ontario in Canada, and the school that I was working with, well, there's 2 schools in the community, and they draw from an 8,000 square kilometer area, so it's a vast area, and there's very small communities that are kind of interspersed within there. So it's drawing youth from all these different communities. There's Aboriginal communities, there's very small, unorganized townships, and bringing all these youth together into the local high schools. And there's basically 3 sort of, I guess, ethnic communities in that area. So there's the Ojibwe Aboriginal Anishinaabe First Nations communities, and the Francophone community, and then basically those of Anglo-European descent. And so there's 2 high schools, a French Catholic high school and a public high school, and all of these youth attend one of these 2 high schools. So that was the group that I was working with, and they're youth aged 14 to 20. And so basically what I did, I was really focused on using Photovoice as a community arts intervention as well. So I brought the youth together similar to the way that Kathy did it, and but really focus on the training, doing things around photography in terms of it being an art form, so focusing on the design elements and lighting and composition and that kind of thing. And I brought in professional artists from the area to work with the youth. So that was kind of creating, bridging social capital between the youth and local professionals. And had them focus on really creating the photographs as an art piece. And they were focusing on, they decided on a theme which would be changes in perspective. So what changes the youth wanted to see in the community, or which had already happened, which were positive or negative in the community. And perspectives in that they're providing the perspective of the youth. So through their own dialogue and conversations, the youth decided on that theme that they wanted to use for the photographs. So some of the issues that we're facing in these rural communities, it's happening across rural areas of Canada, and especially in, well, maybe not especially in Ontario, but certainly in Ontario, Northern Ontario. Basically, these communities at one point relied on natural resource extraction, so logging, mining, and that kind of thing, and heavy industries such as steel production and that type of thing. And now all of that is in decline. So a lot of the industry is leaving, a lot of the people are leaving. There's a lot of out-migration of youth. So that's a big issue in these communities. And it kind of results in things such as, similar things actually that Kathy found in her study. So substance abuse, there's a lot of teen pregnancy, dropping out of school at a young age, these kind of issues, and these are all on the rise. So that's the sort of context of this project. And so I wanted to see in that context how using Photovoice as a community arts initiative can create health enabling communities, or what I call youth empowering communities, which draws on some of Kathy's work. So that's the kind of background that I went into the project with. So these youth came together and they took photographs around the strengths and barriers of their community, and focusing specifically on the theme that they decided of, which was changes in perspectives. And what I thought was really interesting about the photographs that they came up with was that I really emphasized when I did the photography training and when we worked with the artists that a lot of what they came up with wouldn't necessarily have to be literal representations of what's happening in the community, but symbolic. And that really is where the creative art part of it comes in as well. So some of the photos, for instance, there's one that's simply a photograph of a rock being thrown into a river. And what the youth said about that, he's one of the more at-risk Aboriginal youth. And he was very intuitive. It was really interesting to sort of see his creative thought process throughout the project. And what he said about this was, the rock is like a person waiting to jump in the water, pausing, taking a moment, taking time to think. This shows the impact of drugs on the kids in the community. I'm taking the time to think so I don't end up like my dad, who lives in Jane and Finch in Toronto and is a Crip. So Crip is a member of a gang. So he's really sort of cognizant of, you know, his role in this community, the impact of, you know, family influences and social dynamics and all that kind of thing. And he's saying, you know, he's presenting this symbolically through a photograph. And he also he employed a lot of the creative techniques that the artist had taught him. So it was really neat to see that as well. And when we did the public exhibition, we had a lot of teachers and principals and community leaders coming to the exhibition, and some of them said to me about a lot of the different youth, you know, I would never have imagined that this person would have put that on the wall, that they would have been that creative, that they would have been that artistic. And for each of the different youth as well, it was kind of, there were different levels of success. So for some it was success because they simply took part in the project and they followed through in the project and they were engaged in it. Because these are youth who are very, who have been well known as being difficult to engage, and they'll identify themselves that way as well. And then there are others who, it was really amazing how creative they were. So another of the photos, Speak, it's just an amazingly artistic photograph. The composition, the subject matter, it's a very beautiful photograph. And then there were others who, what the message that they were sending was really interesting, because it's very intuitive, very, you know, there was a lot of thought that went behind it. So there are different levels of sort of engagement and what made it successful for each of these different youth. So that was really interesting.
So in terms of the editing, how many photos have you talked about?
One of the groups that I worked with for this project was an at-risk Aboriginal group of boys, and it was interesting doing this project because in this community, these different communities tend to be fairly disparate, and they also organize themselves that way in the project. So there was the Aboriginal youth, the Francophone youth, and the Anglo-European youth. And so it was a little bit difficult to bring them together, but there was some sense of being able to work together as well. And one of the photos that the Aboriginal youth took was called Skylar Drumming. And he says about it, this picture shows that kids these days still have a feeling for the culture. The culture was never lost, it's still there. The Native Resource Room is somewhere to come and do your work by yourself. There's not so much distraction like in a normal class, and the programs Reggie sets up for us are awesome. So these are youth that don't function within the regular educational system. They're in an alternative kind of program because they don't tend to go to class, basically. So they're at risk of, you know, not graduating and that kind of thing. And I spoke with them in different focus groups, and it was really interesting hearing what their take was on, you know, what the influences are in the community about why they make the choices that they do in terms of, you know, partaking in drugs and not going to school and that kind of thing. So, and some of it comes out in the photographs as well.
Can you also talk a bit about the exhibition that you had at the end?
Sure. So throughout the project, I really also focus on it being a youth-led initiative. So right from the beginning I said, you know, I'm facilitating this, but it's your project. And one of the aspects of that was for them to organize the public exhibition, which was going to happen at the end of 4 weeks. And they really took it and ran with it. I wasn't sure if that part of it would fly. I just kind of put it out there, and they said, you know, this is something we're really interested in. So they really took it and ran with that idea. So they organized every aspect of it. They did curatorial training with a local curator at the local art gallery. And so there were 2 youth who ended up curating the space. They obviously took all the photos and decided on the frames and how it would all be presented. And they also approached different people in the community for donations, in-kind and financial donations. in order to make the exhibition come to be, and they did basically all of the decision making around it, which in a short time span is not a small feat. So I was very impressed with the level of engagement that it really showed, and also through that I felt that that was kind of a space for social bonding, and that's the creative space as well, where they are all working together towards a common creative end. So I thought that was really neat. And then when the actual exhibition was put on, we had an opening, and all the community, well, not all the community leaders, but a number of community leaders came, including the mayor and the local member of parliament, which was really exciting because we just had a federal election, so she had just been elected, and she came by and did a little speech about the project and in support of it. And the youth were able to dialogue with these different community leaders, as in Kathy's project, and I spoke with them after, and they were really excited by that. Just the pride in their faces, and being able to engage with these people that they normally would never have that opportunity. I think, well, they said, it really meant something to them. And from that, the mayor who came was very interested in the project. She was very supportive of it, and she said she really wanted this kind of thing to continue. And so she invited the youth to speak to the town council about their ideas and the changes that they wanted to see in the community that were presented at the Photovoice exhibition. And so a number of the youth did that, and now they're working together. They have the Blind River Youth Council is working with the youth to create different kinds of youth programming, basically, youth arts programming, and other kind of programming as well. So there really was that chance for critical dialogue to happen between the community leaders and the youth. And another interesting thing is that the exhibition is going to travel to Toronto in the fall. So it will be part of a National Youth Arts Conference. And that's because I worked on the project with the Arts Network for Children and Youth, and they're planning this National Arts Conference. So the youth and the photos are going to go there, which is really a good opportunity, again, for the bridging social capital to be built. A lot of these youth, well, some of them anyways, have never actually been to Toronto. They've never really been outside of Northern Ontario. So it's an opportunity for them to build their social mobility and bridging social capital and that kind of thing. So.
Oh, thanks, Robin. It's amazing to hear you lay it all out like that. Yeah, and all the best for the next stages.
Thank you.
Okay, Morten.
Yes.
You tell us something about the work you've done in Kenya.
Yeah, I've used Photovoice in a slightly different way from both Robin and Kathy. And the context of where I used the Photovoice project, as you say, in Western Kenya, it's in the Bondo district. In Kenya, it's one of the poorest districts. It's hard hit by HIV and AIDS. Estimates are that the prevalence rate of HIV in this district is 15%, which is still twice the national average. And this is just the official HIV rate. If you were to ask the medical officer of the district, he would say that the HIV prevalence rate is around 25%. As a result of these high levels of HIV, there's been a lot of studies going on in this particular district, also looking at the impact of AIDS on children. And one of those studies has found that in this particular district, 1 out of 3 children have lost one or both parents, and 1 out of 9 children have lost both their parents, both their biological parents. So AIDS is having a huge impact on children's lives in this particular district. And what these statistics don't quite show is that what many of these kids are doing before they lose their parents is that they've been taking care of their parents before they die. So the topic of my study was on young carers, or caregiving children, as I also call them. And we use Photovoice, not necessarily to create social change in the way that you guys have done it, but more as a research method, really for us to learn more about their lives, but also to encourage them to work with a local NGO for social action. So it's not about challenging kind of what's it called?
Unequal power
relations in their life worlds, but really just to deal with their basic needs, which in this case was having food on the table, having proper shelter, having a decent uniform and so on. So it's quite a different context from your projects. The way we did it was to have community health workers from two different community-based organizations identify children who care above the average of other children in the district. And they managed to identify 48 children from these two community groups. And we grouped these kids together into youth clubs. And we started by not doing the Photovoice, not doing research with them, but we started doing sports and health education. So really just providing them with footballs, volleyball, all the equipment they needed to do these things, pens, papers, anything they can use for drawing, and just to be creative and spend some time with each other. And that kind of created the space for them to get to know each other, to know that they're all in the same boat, because we didn't label these kids as young carers or as caregiving children. They're just kids from the community who've been brought together. This was all provided by this local NGO, so that's the context. And the NGO was then wondering, in what ways can we then provide these kids with meaningful support in a way that really helps them cope with the difficult circumstances. And Photovoice was the obvious tool to look into that, to explore how best to support them. So they provided all 48 kids with disposable cameras. And they had the cameras for 2 weeks, and they asked the children to go out into the communities and say, take pictures of what your life is like, what is good about your life, what makes you strong, and what needs to change. So these are the 4 instructions that the kids received with the disposable cameras. They had it written down on little pieces of paper. And they went out into the communities. But before they went into the communities, they went through some workshops. First workshop was on how to use a camera. These were poor kids, maybe for the first time they were having access to a camera. Little things like don't put your finger in front of the lens, and the lighting and other things had to just be talked about and explored. And they had a few cameras that they were using in the first stage just to try it out. And we developed those photos, and we then discussed, how can they make these photos better by taking them outside in the light and not inside, and so on. We also had a workshop on the ethics of taking photos in this particular context. We'll talk about ethics later. So we had a good discussion about that. But particular to this project was that we talked about if you want to share your stories about a parent who's ill, the parent might be lying inside the hut, visibly ill, being bedridden, and we discussed whether it would be sensible to take pictures of someone in that situation. And I think as a collective, all the kids agreed that it could be quite demeaning and to take pictures of their parents in those situations. And they agreed that if they want to talk about the parents who might be bedridden inside the hut, they would draw it instead of taking a picture. So that's how we overcame that particular kind of dilemma in using photography. So they went out into the field for 2 weeks with their cameras, took photos using the 4 instructions of what is your life like, what is good about your life, what needs to change, and what makes you strong. And these guidelines had a focus on their coping and what are the assets in their community that help them cope with these very difficult circumstances. So the idea with this would be that based on those reflections on what helps them cope and what helps them move on, would be that we could draw on those reflections to develop action plans that they could then kind of action. That they could then implement. Yeah. So they would use the photographs to develop action plans to facilitate the construction of action plans that they could then implement later on with the support of this local NGO who had resources available for this. When the kids came back from the field, from the 2 weeks of taking the photographs, we had to facilitate this kind of dialogue and kind of reflection about what photos they've taken. Clearly they had, there was 36 pictures on these cameras, and they had to narrow it down. We had to focus on this. And to enable them to narrow down the number of photos they wanted to talk about, we asked them to think about, to choose 6 photos, their 6 favorite photos, photos that had to show how they get by, things they lack, and something or someone who's important to them. So to facilitate their reflection on their photographs for the development of this these social action plans. We asked them to pick 6 of their favorite photos. They should either show like how they got by, things they lack, or something or someone who has been helping them in their local community context. And then the instructions we gave them to reflect on these photos were, I want to share this photo because, and then they had to write a little essay about that. What is the real story that this photo tells? And then they'll write a little reflection about that. And how does this story relate to my life and to the wider community? And then they'll write a little story about that. So the kids would then have those 6 photos that they had decided they had picked. They would have those little reflections. And in workshops, we would then share those photos the kids would share those photos with each other, and they'll read up their little reflections, so that all the kids were familiar with what was important to them in getting by. And if we look at some of the photos, I've got some of them here. It was quite clear. Let's just look at these 2 here. That farming and their farming was quite an important element of their coping. That they would talk about how having access to a piece of land would help them cope. So it wasn't necessarily about, that they would have someone who would give them food, but it's the fact that they would take an active role in negotiating access for land so that they could farm the land, and that could help them get food on the table and feed their parents as well. So there's quite a few photos talking about farming. Some of the photos that they took had been staged. Here's a photo of a child who is feeding someone else, not feeding the parent or the person they're taking care of. But the story behind the picture was that the child wanted to show the fact that he would spend quite a lot of time feeding his or her parent in doing these caring duties. Something else that came out quite a lot in the photos was the importance of friendship and peers in their schools. And that really took me by surprise, because I kind of would expect that it would be neighbors and the church groups and other adults who would be, the ones that people see as the primary source of support. But church groups and neighbors, of course, were mentioned, but friends and peer support really came out quite strongly in the way that they would say, here are friends from my school class. Some of them have also lost their parents, and some of them have also had parents who are sick. And when their parents are sick, we can help each other to go home and do some farming, or fetch some water, or burn some charcoal, and help out that particular child during that period. And then if my parent gets really ill, all the kids will come and help me. Mm-hmm. So the kids have set up these little support networks, which really was quite admirable.
Can I ask you just to talk a little bit about how you used all this as the background for your social action fund work?
The way we used these photos to develop the social action plans was by the kids sharing these photos with each other, sharing their stories that they had written for these, about these stories to each other, about these pictures to each other. And we would then do some brainstorming where the kids would say, these are the key themes that help us cope with difficult circumstances, and these are the key people who help us cope with difficult circumstances. And we had a whole list of things that they would like to do, and they would like to see their abilities to be strengthened in, say, farming, for example. And just with a ranking, doing a ranking exercise with a show of hands, the kids would then decide these are the top issues that we need to address. And they would then.
Can you give us some examples?
Some examples. Oh yeah, of course, yeah. And in one of the communities, as these pictures here would show, farming was a key issue. So the kids in their action plans wrote down that they wanted to do kale farming. So they wanted to get farming implements and seeds, so that the kids themselves could do some farming. To do this, they had to get access to land. So they asked a local leader in this community whether they could to borrow some land to do this. And this leader, he gave them a small plot where they could do their seedlings first. So they just put in little seeds, and they grew up to come back to be small little plants. And then they would take these little small plants and put it into a much bigger field. And that's when they would grow things like kale, like as what you see in this particular picture here. And during harvest, they would then take the kale into the local village, sell it, and the revenue from that they could use in either buying pens or paper for schooling, or if someone needed to replace an element of their school uniform, they could do that. It wasn't huge amounts of money that they raised from these activities, but that was not necessarily the point. The point was that by bringing these kids together, and by these kids doing these kind of social action activities, they would gain new skills, and they could use these skills not necessarily as a collective, but also individually at home. They could share the skills that they learned with their with neighboring kids. So there was a lot of child-to-child kind of transfer of information,
and quite a lot of strengthening of peer support networks through engagement in those activities.
Yeah.
Thanks, Morten, for that. I think you've given us a great sense of how you went from activity to photo into NGO Social Action Fund and so on. Can you talk a little bit, I mean, maybe we can all talk a bit, but Morten's written about this specifically, about the ethical challenges. All right, you've already spoken about the ethical challenges of taking, ethical challenges of taking photos of people that are ill. That would be the one thing. What about the ethical issue of taking photographs of children and young people? I mean, how have you all, because certainly in terms of data protection and in terms of ethics of working with children, there's a lot written about how you have to have informed consent to use images of children, to use material generated by children. I mean, do any of you want to talk about how you tackled that? Did you use consent forms? Do you want to start, Kathy? Or do you want you go first, because you've written?
Yeah, I guess, yeah. One of the key things with, one of the key dilemmas in using photography in research, for example, is the fact that photography could, you can intrude into someone's personal space by taking a photograph. And even though it may not be an illegal thing, because I could walk around with the kids and I could see the same thing as the kids were taking a picture of. So even though it might not be illegal, it raises these moral questions about how the photos are then subsequently used. And I think that's where the key problem is with using images and photography in research, because how you represent, how you instruct, how you describe your photos is where the power lies in using photography. And giving these kids these cameras gives them, in that sense, quite a lot of power in articulating something that's important to them. But they can also abuse that power by talking about situations that could be demeaning to someone else, for example. And that needs to be managed one way or another, for example, through informed consent.
And how do you get conformed consent in a situation? How do you get informed consent in a situation like that?
The blueprint is that you need at least 3 consent forms. The first one is the standard one that you give to anyone doing research, where you just have them consent to the fact they're participating in the project. So that would be the photographer, for example, where the photographer consents that I'm happy to participate in this project. The photographer is aware of how many times they need to go to the workshops and so on. The second consent form would be where the photographer has to obtain consent from the person who's being photographed. So if you take this photo here, for example, the child was taking a photograph of an elderly woman. The child would then, for example, with a little notebook, have to ask this woman, is it okay if I take a photo of you? And afterward, I guess you can ask for consent before or after the photo has been taken. I guess getting the consent before is better, but sometimes you might miss kind of the action of what you want to catch in when taking the photograph. But you can go afterwards and ask, is it okay if I use this photo for a particular person? And the woman can, yes, consent to that or not. And a third level of consent would be to ask the child who have then taken this photograph and who has obtained the consent, is it okay for us, the researchers, to use this photograph, for example, for exhibitions somewhere or in publications? Or I would say that these are the 3 levels of informed consent that would be important for Photovoice. But of course, it doesn't always work like that. And I think all of us would have examples of where these blueprints of informed consent didn't quite materialize in the way we wanted.
So Morten's talked about how in his research he had 3 consent forms from the children, from the people being photographed, and
the child who took the photo. But both of them would, because when the child asks this woman, she would ask, she would say then, there's a potential this photo could be used for.
All right. And your children had a notebook.
Yeah.
And did they get signatures?
Mhm.
And okay, so
that was the ideal. That was what they were supposed to do.
Yeah.
But it didn't always work like that.
Morton's told us how he tackled ethical issues in his study. What were the ethical issues that jumped out at you when you were doing your work?
There are a number that were, consent was an ethical issue that we had to deal with, but perhaps the issues that caused a lot more discussion and debate in the project were one around taking photographs of things that might be illegal or sensitive or stigmatising of a community. And there it was important that the young people found a way to tell the stories about drug use or guns or sex work or things that were illegal or undesirable in their communities in a way that still communicated their message and their priority, but that didn't identify individuals in a way that might be harmful to them later. So, for example, they would be quite creative about how they take photographs of drug use and take photographs of people rolling up their leaves into joints for marijuana, but without their faces in the photograph, just their hands. Another big ethical issue that came up was actually the ethics of asking people or encouraging people to be participants in a project that's doing something as odd as taking photographs in a rural village. That by young people going out and taking, these are kids who've never had cameras before, cameras don't normally appear in the villages, young people are suddenly violating social norms by doing something quite unusual, and that makes them very visible, and that visibility makes them vulnerable to gossip and to jealousy and some negative ramifications in their existing social ties that perhaps we hadn't realised the extent of that prior to the project. And so that's an ethical thing, I think, for researchers, but also NGOs to think about when you select a young person as a peer educator and give them status by being a peer educator and training and access to resources that other people in the community don't have, that may disrupt social ties in ways you're unaware of. And how we dealt with that was all the way through the project. Obviously it was voluntary participation, and if people were feeling uncomfortable they could withdraw, and none of them did for that reason, but they did talk about sometimes feeling that everyone was gossiping about them or watching what they were doing. But they really dealt with that through their social support of each other. That was the main way that they sort of looked after each other in that context. And then the final ethical issue that cropped up for me that I'd like to talk about was an example where one of the participants had taken a photograph of a very young boy, who was probably only about 10, who was drinking homebrewed alcohol and smoking marijuana, and his face was visible in the photograph. And it's a very evocative photograph. It's taken late at night. He's this sort of squinting with the cigarette smoke, and he's this old little man on skinny little child's body. And the participants in that particular group all wanted to use the photograph, and I said, oh no, he's only 10, he can't consent, have you, and they said, oh, he really wants the photo to be in our exhibition. I said, but he's only 10 and he's high, have you asked his parents? Of course there weren't parents, that was part of the problem. And so there was a lot of discussion around me being from my public health background saying we can't use this photograph, and the youth really challenging me and saying, but isn't it unethical not to talk about this? Mm-hmm. And so actually it was a really good example of dialogue, because we probably argued, is a fair way to put it, about this particular photograph for weeks. And how they ended up resolving this question. We brought in staff from the NGO that they were volunteers with, and we all discussed this particular issue and a particular photograph and how to deal with it. And in the end they decided that because this child was well known in that local community, everyone stepped over him on the way into the market to buy their produce, that it wasn't going to stigmatise him by showing the picture in the local community, because his identity and situation were already known, but that they weren't comfortable and didn't give permission to use that photograph in a region, in the provincial exhibition or in my thesis or in any publications. So I think the youth were wanting it in the local exhibition as a real advocacy tool to say, someone should be doing something about this. And through that action, they did link that boy in with services such as they were in that small local community and reconnected him with an aunt and so on. But it was a very difficult ethical dilemma for me as a researcher, because that's not the approach I would normally have taken, but we did come to new knowledge that we constructed together in dialogue about what to do about in this particular instance.
How did you deal with ethics in your Photovoice work?
Well, I did use the consent forms as well. I actually worked with Morton a bit to to create them before I went out in the field. So I kind of combined some of them though. So with I really tried to be very comprehensive in terms of where the photographs might be used, because the youth also created a blog about the project, and they use Facebook a lot. So Facebook was social media in general was a big part of sort of how we communicated about the project. So, and they really wanted to put the photographs on Facebook and on the blog, and so that obviously just opens it up to be, you know, that much more publicly available. So in the consent forms, I was sure to just really say, you know, very comprehensively all of the possible places that it could be used, you know, on the internet and research reports, in the exhibition locally, in the exhibition in Toronto. And the youth were very open to all that. Like, they basically wanted their photos to go wherever it was possible for them to go. So, but just making sure that that was in the consent form, and also that was also in the consent form for those being photographed as well. So that was, yeah, so that was an issue. And one of the other things that I was a bit concerned about was some of the youth shared some very personal sort of aspects of their lives. And so I wanted to just make sure with them, I mean, they had signed the consent form, so they knew what it was being used for and where it could possibly go, and I explained that verbally as well. But I just wanted to make sure, you know, when we were working together and they were telling me what they wanted to say about the photographs, I said, okay, so you know where this is going and you're okay with sharing this publicly, especially in such a small community. You know, everybody knows everybody, so the people seeing the photograph and reading that description will know exactly who's taking it and that they're sharing something about their life. So, but they were always, you know, we really want to share this, and they felt that it was important to be able to sort of share it with other youth who were going through the same things as themselves, which I thought was a really neat kind of sentiment for them to have. So, yeah, those are some of the main issues that I guess I dealt with.
We've covered a lot of ground. I wonder if anybody wants to bring up anything that they think we've left out. Have we said enough? I mean, I know that Kathy and Morton have already written quite a lot about their work, and hopefully Robin will be doing so shortly.
Yes.
So what we'll do at the end of this video is to put up a reading list for people who want to follow up some of the more formal writing we've done in this area. So I think really just to thank Kathy, who's literally an hour ago arrived on the plane from Australia via Heathrow and hasn't slept for too many hours. And thanks to Morton and Robin, who didn't travel quite as far. And particular thanks to Steve Gaskell and Lee Vu, who are working with us to put this video together, both in terms of the camera and editing. Thank you very much to both of you. Over and out.